All right, week 4 summary for my schooling. Sorry, this is a little bit late being released. It's been a crazy week. As you can tell, I'm missing an entire bookshelf over here. We had to take everything out of our house and then redo all our flooring and put it all back in. I mentioned in one of my earlier videos, we had a flood about 2.5 months ago, and we just got our carpet in last week. So in fact, this bookshelf here that was here had mold on the bottom, so we got rid of it, and I've got another one ordered. So hopefully by next week I'll have another bookshelf there and all my books back up. So it's been a crazy week, that is for sure. So let's talk about what I've been learning in my classes this week. So this week in my interfaith leadership class, we spent some time looking at some definitions. So to help us just understand some common language when dealing with interfaith. So of course, interfaith is people of different faiths coming together for a common cause. That's what interfaith is. So you're not you could doctrinally disagree on certain points, but come together to help each other with something, like a food bank or a nonprofit organization or other things like that, where it's let's come together and discuss things. Sometimes we can discuss religious things and agree to disagree, or we can discuss non-religious things and work together for a common cause, like inside a community. Religious diversity is a term that means there's lots of different religions within a greater community. The one term we spent the most time on was called pluralism. Now, pluralism is the understanding of bringing these diverse groups together to work together. It does not mean that they harmonize their doctrines together, but it means they see each other as important parts of the community, and they build networks to communicate with each other and to collaborate on whatever project or thing it is. It could be one single thing that you discuss. It could be multiple different levels that you discuss and work with them on. So that's pluralism, is those networks, the active connecting of different religions together, basically, as far as the people in those religions to work together for a common cause. That is pluralism. So that's an important term to understand. One thing that's been interesting is while we were learning these terms, I've started noticing that the LDS Church actually encourages pluralism. It is encouraging. There is a person called the Area Communications Director, and their job is to work with nonprofits and other religions to find ways to come together for common causes. And they're starting to put stake and ward groups together. I'm curious to see, in fact, if you are LDS, if you've heard of a stake communications director or ward communications director in your area. I know I live in the Utah North area, so we have this establishment. So there are people that their job, their calling in the church, is to connect with other leaders of other churches and nonprofit organizations and find ways to work together in a local way. The church has done this nationally with the church charities. Sister Eubanks has talked a lot about that, some of the talks she's given in General Conference and other things. But now they're bringing it to stake and ward level to get more pluralism, more connections and opportunities for multiple religions to come work together for a common cause. And I think that's cool that they're working on that. I think that's a future trend we're going to see, which is why I'm actually getting this certification by taking these leadership classes, so that I can say I can help with this. I can do something with this. So it was fun. That was a fun thing to go through. We talked about different nonprofits, organizations that help with pluralism, with other things. Social capital was another thing we talked about as well. Social capital, there's two kinds of, so social capital is the ability for you to have an influence in a community, basically. That's your social capital. So if you have a lot of social capital, it means when you have a lot of influence within your community to do something. If you do not have a lot of social capital, then you're not going to have a good influence. I think a great example is if you ever watched McHale's Navy, especially the more newer version that they did. back in the 90s. The McHale's Navy, you remember McHale is not in the Navy anymore, but he has lots of influence among the sailors and the people on the island and stuff. And so he gets a lot of things done, despite working around Navy regulations and rules and things. So he has a lot of social capital, whereas the guy that's running the Navy base, the I can't remember what his name was, but anyways, uh, he has low social capital. He has power because of his status in the Navy, but he has no social capital. No one wants to listen to him. So that's kind of a fun way to think about it. And so bonded social capital is where we have social capital within a group. So if you are in a church and you have a lot of influence in that church with people, not power as much as influence, then you have a lot of social capital. So that's bringing people together within your organization. Bridged social capital is where you are taking different groups and bringing them together. So the social capital is reaching across different groups, like bringing two religions together for a common good. That's bridged social capital. So those are some of the terms that we learned more about this week. In my Mormonism class, we had some fun discussions about things. So one of the things that we've been studying in my Mormonism class, and this was one of the books that I had read earlier and I talked about it, was this American Scriptures book. This is actually the book here. It's kind of a small, squatty book, little thick in the pages, but it's a short book. I mean, that's like 6 or 7 inches big. It's not a huge book. This is a really interesting book. So this book talks about different types of revelations that were given to people that had churches in America. So there's revelations in here. One of the ones we read about this week was actually this guy who used to be a member of the LDS Church, had his own revelation claiming to be a prophet himself that was a warning to the Latter-day Saints that the Promised Land was not in Utah but in California, and that they needed to go there. And Joseph and Brigham wasn't the prophet. It was kind of an interesting thing to read. The Book of Mormon is in here. About 4 or 5 chapters of the Book of Mormon is in here because it's an American scripture as well as scriptures from lots of different groups that are in here. So we read a couple of them. The thing that was interesting, and I think I mentioned this in the last video I did about this book over the summer, was there's a difference in the revelations that Joseph Smith gives and the revelations everybody else gives. Most everybody else, their revelations either go along the same lines as what we already have in the Old Testament or New Testament. Like they use a lot of Old Testament or New Testament language. They sound familiar to those. They talk about similar themes and ideas. And it's not bad. We see sometimes where repetition is, or people, the thing is they're not necessarily trying to quote the Old Testament, but they're trying to sound like the Old Testament. It was really interesting because when you think about what is the message they're delivering and is that message already in the Bible, the answer is predominantly yes. The answer is in the Bible, unless it's a very different kind of revelation. Like that guy had that revelation that claimed to be telling the Mormons that they were sinners and needed to repent and needed to go to California instead of Utah. Except for certain instances like that, it's a little more specific. Then those were different. But if it tried to be a general revelation for a church, they often came across like the themes, the concepts, the ideas they talked about were the same as what we already have in the Bible. And so I kept thinking, if God is going to send angels down, if God's going to do something, exert energy to work with us, why would he exert more energy to talk about the same things with us? It doesn't make sense. There needs to be new. There needs to be more stuff. So he might say, here's what I told you then, but now here's more. Or let me expound upon what I said back then and give you more here, or other things like that. And that's what we get with the Joseph Smith revelations. Is it's not just the same thing, it's more. There's more. Even in the Book of Mormon, a lot of people say, oh, but the Book of Mormon just sounds like Old Testament and New Testament stuff. It has a similar concept. And yes, it's written in the Old English, and so it literally reads in a similar way. but it dives deeper into some of the doctrines of Christianity that it doesn't go into that depth in the Bible. So there's some things where the Bible goes deeper, and oftentimes the Book of Mormon quotes the Bible, like Isaiah, on that, and other times the Book of Mormon goes deeper into those things. So it's really an interesting contrast, but it definitely built my testimony of Joseph as a prophet, because again, he's not giving us just the same stuff we've always got, like a lot of these were. It's new stuff. It's new things he's giving us, not just the same old. So that was kind of fun to to study and to play with. I'm sure we got a lot more chapters in this book, and so I'm sure we're going to go through a lot more of it as well as we keep learning about the church. Also, there is, so let me get into my graduate level class, my religious studies program. This week we read a book called Domingos Alvarez. This is a really interesting book, especially if you've ever been fascinated with the slave trade, you know, the 1500s, 1600s time frame, even into 1700s time frame, with like the whole Atlantic trade with Portugal. So this is a story of Portugal going to the Angolan coast of Africa, getting slaves, and then going to Brazil to sell the slaves, where they can be used in the mines and in the sugar plantations. And then the goods from the mines and the sugar plantations and things are then sent to Portugal. This triangle of trade. So this is not Spain, this is Portugal that this one's talking about. So Domingos Alvarez is a gentleman born in Africa, born in the 1500s, I believe, is when he was. Born in a tribal area where the Dahomey Empire kind of takes over. So he's early as the Dahomean Empire is starting to move. Agaja is the king. He starts to take over lots of tribal groups and grow his empire bigger. Domingos comes from a family of priests. So they have a religion that would be called Vodunun. And what they do is they believe in supernatural beings, like sometimes ancestors or other beings that represent supernatural forces that can then be summoned or accessed to help us with healing in our lives. Emotional healings, physical healings, it's all the same thing. And they can be used to help us, as well as curse our enemies and offer us protection as well. So it's really just an interesting thing. Today we would probably look at it and say, you know, they're using herbs, they're cooking stuff up and getting smoke to come off of things, and they'll inhale the smoke, and they sometimes feel like they're possessed and dancing around or divining things and stuff. We might look at it as kind of a voodoo type idea. And maybe that's where some of the voodoo ideas came from, was from more of this Vodunism. But it's interesting because the challenge is because he is a priest, he was probably around 18, 19, 20 years old when the Dahomean Empire marched in and took over his land and a lot of other tribal lands in his area. Because he's seen as a priest and he can control supernatural, the king didn't like it, because any control of supernatural that he could not control meant he didn't have all the power, which meant somebody could overthrow him. So he basically sold all the Vodun priests into slavery to get rid of them. And then he reoriented the religion in Africa, or their culture, because religion and culture is kind of the same thing back then. He remakes the religion and culture to worship him and his ancestors. So he puts himself in the succession of like spiritual beings, or almost like he's in succession of a god. So you worship his ancestors. You pray to his ancestors, his people. So anyways, Domingos Alvarez gets shipped off. Now it's interesting to look at the slave trade aspect of this, because What happened was the Portuguese would come down. They built a fort to protect themselves and their interests. Then they had like a warehouse built, and what they do is a slave ship would come down, and then that slave ship had a quota. They had to fill so many slots in their boat, and so they would stay in port until they got enough. They could acquire enough slaves from these kings that are ruling, either acquiring themselves, or most of the time they were making deals with these kings that are trying to conquest and conquer everybody else, and buy, give them goods, give them like tobaccos or rum or other things like that, gold and silver, sometimes different things like that. They would give that to the king. The king would sell a bunch of slaves to the Portuguese, and then they would pack them into this warehouse for a couple months until they had enough. So the warehouse was like a jail where they could pack them in and hold them there until they had enough, and then they would load the boat. Because the problem is you might be thinking, why didn't they just load the boat? Well, the boat, there wasn't like an official dock that the boat could pull into, so the boat was kept offshore. And so there was a ferry. You'd have a tender boat that would go back and forth from shore to the boat, but the boat only had so many supplies. And so if you put all the slaves on the boat, and it took a couple months to get your boat filled with slaves, you have to feed them, you have to take care of them, and so that lowers the amount of supplies on the boat, and then the boat has to go down to another part of Africa or to an island to get supplies before it can make the trek across the Atlantic. And so they tried not to do that. So they kept them on shore, would feed them there with local foods and local things, would do things there. And then they would then load them on the boat once they had enough to put them to fill up the boat, or enough that the captain said, "Fine, that's enough. We'll go. We'll still make a profit on this ship." And then they'll get on the boat, and then they'll sail over to Brazil. So they pack them in like sardines. They didn't let them out a whole lot. They spent most of the time below deck. Sometimes they'd let them out to walk around and eat and things. The meager rations. A lot of people, if you were sick during this process, you were probably just going to die. In fact, it's interesting. There was a rumor among the Africans that when these white men would come down, they were cannibals. And if they load you on their boat, they take you away to eat you. And it was funny because part of the challenge was for the Portuguese was, how do we know if these guys, if these slaves are healthy? And they believed at the time that if you tasted the sweat of a slave, you could tell something about them if they were sick or not. And the other challenge they had was they wanted young men. So the easiest way to tell if we got a young man versus an old man is if they're gotten to the point of needing to shave. If they've reached the point where they need to shave, then they don't want to take them. They want the men that are young. They want young men, and so they haven't got to the point where they need to shave yet. So these kings that were selling their fellow blacks into slavery, they would shave the people. They'd shave the men to try to get some of the older ones to be passed off as younger ones to sell them into slavery. And so what the Portuguese learned to do was they would, and this, I know this sounds gross, but they would lick the cheek of the slave. And so their tongue, as you licked, would feel if there's any stubble. If there's stubble, then they're too old. Kick them out. If they can't feel stubble, then they're young enough to be okay for the slave trade. And you would also be tasting their sweat at the same time you lick them. And so what was funny is, so the Portuguese are using this, licking them. So the doctor would come up and like grab the face and like lick your face, and to feel for stubble and to taste your sweat to see if they could tell if you're sick or not. But to the Africans, they thought they're preparing us to eat us. So it's just kind of funny how, people made these assumptions about what was going on during that time. So anyways, they get on the boats. They had about a 10% attrition rate. So if they loaded, 100 slaves onto a boat, 10 of them are going to die on the way to Brazil. So they just accounted for those numbers in their efforts. When they got to Brazil, they unloaded them, they sold them into slavery within a couple days, and then the plantation owners or the mine owners would then pick them up and put them in slavery. So Domingos, he is a priest, a Vodun priest of what's known as the Sakpata, which is a snake deity, basically. And he had been trained, his parents were priests and priestesses, basically, and so he had been trained in the religion. He knew how to do the healing arts, how to find certain herbs to heal, how to deal with possessions, evil spirits, and other things like that. And so he just knew this, and so he used that when he was in Brazil. Now, when they're hired, when the slaves are bought, basically, they are purchased to be manual labor. So go pick the sugar cane, go work in the mines, those kinds of things that we use machinery for today. It was manual labor back then, and so they used slaves because they didn't have to pay them. They just fed them and housed them, and that was it. They just kept them barely alive. The interesting thing about all this, you might be thinking, well, but this is a religious class, right, Curtis? Yes, this is a religious class. So the Catholic Church endorsed the slave trade. The Catholic Church's philosophy was that if we are bringing these Africans, these are pagan people, they worship weird stuff, they do these like voodoo type weird things, we're going to take them to Brazil, and then we are going to teach them Christianity and baptize them and convert them to the real religion. And so that's part of this process, and that's how the church kind of wrote this off, because it was bringing more converts, more bringing people to Christ through Catholicism. It was up to the slave owners to teach them. Sometimes there were priests in the town that would do some basic stuff to talk to people about baptism and administering sacraments and things. The slaves could go with their masters to church on Sundays to worship, but it was predominantly up to the slave owner to actually teach Catholicism to their slaves. Especially after baptism, it was up to the slave owner to do it. Most just didn't do a good job, so most of the slaves would get baptized but not really know what it was that they were doing. And there's a lot of struggles and challenges with that. The interesting thing is once you're baptized, you are now fall under jurisdiction of the Catholic Church, and which means inquisition if you commit sin or have problems. Well, the challenge for Dominguez in this book about him that James Sweet wrote, it's a really good book, well-written book on microhistory. If you want to understand this, this is a spectacular book to get. James Sweet won a lot of awards for this book. It's a really interesting one. He came across this story because he was looking through archives of Portuguese inquisitions and found that this Domingos Alvarez had a huge file, like just a massive file in the Inquisitions. And so he started to study it and put the whole story together. So Domingos is in Brazil. He's a slave. He's working. He tries to get off on his own a little bit to go look for herbs and things and connect with other people. He tries to heal other slaves. His owners realize the guy can heal, so he can help keep my other slaves healthy, which is a good thing. But sometimes they ask him to heal their own family. So the slave owner's family uses him kind of as a secondary doctor. He sometimes helps, sometimes can't help. And sometimes what would happen is they would do it until it didn't work. When it didn't work, then the slave owners would accuse him of cursing their family, not doing well with their family, and so then they would sell him. He'd get bought by another owner who saw, oh, you can do healings? Oh, I'll let you heal all my slaves, and I'll rent you out. So he got rented out to do this, which was good and bad. It was good because he had more time to do other things than just manual labor, and it was bad because he was still under slavery. He still was severely limited in what he could and couldn't do. His owner had to give him permission to do anything. But he didn't have to do as much manual labor because he was spending time healing other people, and then other slave owners were coming to his master saying, hey, can I hire your dude? Can I rent him basically to heal my slaves? And so then the slave owner would get a percentage of this. Well, he went through 3 slave owners. His third slave owner basically bought him and just rented him out. Just said, you go do your healing. I'm going to let you have a lot of free range. You can walk around the city. You can get an apartment by yourself. Do your healing. Just give me a cut, and we're good. And so Domingos did this. Well, the thing was, is in that day and age, you could buy your freedom. It was called manumission. And what it meant was if you paid a certain amount of money to your slave owner would say, yes, you've paid me, compensated me for you. You can now be a free slave. So you wouldn't have an owner. So you get to be more of a free person in Brazil and do things. And a lot of this was Rio de Janeiro. De Janeiro. I know I just slaughtered that name. Sorry, guys. Was where he was at. So big city, big area. Domingos did this in 1 year. He made so much money healing other people that he was able to purchase his own freedom, his manumission, after 1 year. He bought himself out. He became his own person to an extent. Being black, he was still limited in what he could and couldn't do, but he didn't have a slave owner per se anymore. He got his freedom, and he just kept doing the healing work. In fact, the challenge with his healing work is he got so popular that the Catholic Church started to wonder if he was doing things contrary to Catholic beliefs. Was he getting into divination? Was he trying to use other spirits? Was he using evil spirits to get things done? Things that they would say was against Christianity. It was doing things not the Christian way. And unfortunately, there's a few people that believed he was doing some of these things. Whether he was or wasn't, you can read the book and decide for yourself on that. So he had like the priests would like get the local police people, the guards to come out, and they tried to capture him a couple times to question him, and he kept evading them. He had like 3 or 4 apartments, like different locations throughout the city where he could do his healings. And so if they raided one of them, he'd move to the next one. And every so often he'd just bounce around to the other ones. So they took him quite a while to capture him. They finally captured him. They put him in the local jail, and then they had to send a letter to Portugal to say, hey, we caught this guy. Here's what he's done. We've got a bunch of witnesses who've said, here's things that they've seen him do. We think this is bad. What do you think? And then they would send back, yes, he's done enough wrong. We need to do the Inquisition. Send him to us with all the testimonials and any other testimonials and stuff you have. So this took months because they had to write a letter, send it across on a ship, and then eventually had to come around back to Brazil to get back to them. And then they would say, yes, it was he needs to go to the Inquisition. Then they would load him on the boat. They would load him up with, they build a file of all the testimonials they've gotten from people that can accuse him of doing wrong, and they send it. And now he's got to make the journey from Brazil to Portugal. Well, he gets to Portugal and he goes through the Inquisition. It takes, I think the first time he was there, it took almost 18 months to get through. No, it wasn't 18 months. It was a lot shorter than that. He was there for several months, in and out of jail as they were inquisitioning him and asking him questions and trying to understand what he's doing. His argument was, I healed people, yes, but I didn't like make myself sound like I am God to heal them. I didn't try to be a priest to heal them. I didn't try to use voodoo magic or other things like that to heal them, divinations or things like that. I used herbs. God made plants. Plants have things in them that God put there, and I just use that to heal them. It's all natural. And he wasn't completely honest in doing that. He did use some divination things. He had this lady that she would get possessed, and she had this spirit in her called the captain, and she could like foretell the future of other people and stuff. So that was against the Catholic ideas at the time. Probably still is today, honestly. So he tries to put forth his best argument as to why he's innocent, and they're trying to prove he's guilty. Well, they decide he's guilty, but they can't really pin him with a whole lot of stuff. So what they do is they brand him a felon, basically. If you remember from the other book we read last week on Monocchio, you had to have that branding. So they branded Domingo's a felon. Then they sent him to live for about 4 years to go through his penance in a village in southern Portugal. Well, this village was not nice to felons. Like, no one would give him a job, no one would help him with food, no one would talk to him. So basically, he would just, if he stayed in the city and he obeyed his parole, basically, he would die. He would just starve to death and die. So he broke parole. He went to a neighboring city without telling his parole officer, basically, that he was leaving. So he had to check in with the priest every so often and things and get permission to go places and do stuff. They wouldn't let him out of the city, and so he went on his own to this other city, started doing healings for people, and he got paid. And they sometimes they would feed him, sometimes they'd pay him, and that kept him alive. Well, he riled up a few people that thought he was doing evil, so they turned him in, and then they found out that he's been doing this, so he was on the run for a while, and he kept jumping from different cities to different cities. He actually ran into this guy that owned a hostel, and he stayed with this guy for a while and just kind of became a maintenance person, just help this guy take care of his hostel. And this guy said, "Hey, I've heard that there's buried treasure on here. Can you help me with this?" And he says, "Oh yes, I know how to find the buried treasure." So Dominguez starts this racket where he tells people, "I can find buried treasure. I can divine where it is." They never find anything, basically, but there's stories claiming he has found it before. And in fact, there's some incidences where he says, "Hold on a second," and like the wind's blowing too much. We need to stop, and the wind suddenly stops, and then okay, now we need to dig again. Oh, wind's blowing again. Okay, now we're good. There's weird things like that where it almost seems like he's controlling the elements. I don't. Probably just sheer luck or just perceptions of the people thinking he was. Um, Domingos paid attention to a lot of stuff around him, and so he learned to pick up on cues of people, and he understood social connections with people and who was frustrated with society, who was not, and other things like that. And so he used a lot of this subtle connections, like we would call, what's that term? There's a term that they use for people that they look for all these subtle cues in people. The Woody Harrelson played one of these characters on Catch Me If You Can, or not Catch Me If You Can, Now You See Me, when he played with all those magicians and stuff, where like he just looked for subtle facial cues and other things to pick out what people are thinking or perceiving and stuff. And so I think Domingos picked up on that and knew how to read people and how to work, manipulate them to get what he needed. But anyways, he later gets eventually turned back in to the Inquisition. The Inquisition finally catches him on these other charges that he's running a racket looking for buried treasure and other stuff like that. He goes through the Inquisition again, basically, and they say, "Fine, look, we're going to charge you again." So they make him go through this torture and some other things, basically, and then they're like, "Okay, we're going to send you to this village up in the mountains." So they send him to go to live with this village up in the mountains, and he never makes it. There's no record of him ever making it to check in. There's no record of him in any of the cities in between where the Inquisition was and this city. He didn't check in or get stopped by or do anything in those cities. He just drops off. He just disappears. Because there's a lot of thievery, a lot of robbers along some of these roads. Domingos by this point is probably 50s, maybe 60s. He's just an old black guy that's had a lot of starvation and a lot of malnutrition and other things. There's a good chance he got robbed and killed, and they just dumped his body and took all of his valuables and left. Could he have ran away and fled Portugal and they just haven't found a record of him somewhere else? Maybe. Most likely he probably died. Either he, had a heart attack and died on the journey, because he had like 140 miles he had to walk up into this mountain village. Maybe he died on the journey. Maybe he got sick with something. Maybe he got robbed and killed in the process. Who knows? But he disappears at that point. But it's a fascinating book about the Portuguese Inquisition. So not Spanish Inquisition, but Portuguese Inquisitions, and how they dealt with his philosophies and religions and culture traditions and with slavery and everything else. It's a really good book if you want to understand the slave trade at that time. So it was fun. We had a lot of good stuff that we learned this week. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video and what we've learned and are still learning. Watch all of our videos. We got tons of videos on the Bible. We're in the New Testament right now. So watch those videos to keep learning more. And tune in next week, and I'll let you know what we get to learn about next week. We'll see you then.